When I went to kiss my wife at the couple's dinner, she pulled away slightly, looked at me with cold, distant eyes, and said with a calmness that hurt more than any scream, "I'd rather kiss my boss." For a second, the restaurant stopped. The voices around me faded. The clinking of cutlery seemed to dissolve into the air. I heard it, and time froze, not metaphorically, but in a way that pain seemed to leave my chest and touch my skin. I felt cold. A cold wave ran up my spine and paralyzed me. I looked at her, but she didn't look away. There was no regret in her eyes, not at that moment. There was conviction. There was resolve. And there, with a heavy heart and a silence that screamed inside me, I stood up without saying a single word. I left the table, I left the restaurant, I left my dignity dripping onto the floor, and I took with me only one certainty: that was the end of our story. The following days were a kind of emotional coma. My body was there, but my soul seemed to have been ripped away by her words. What do you do after you discover that love has turned to contempt? What's left when the person you trusted most turns everything into nothing? I reviewed every conversation, every hug, every gesture over the past few months. I tried to find the moment everything changed, when her love left through a door I hadn't seen open. I tried to blame myself, I tried to hate myself, I tried to understand if it had been my distraction or her inattention, but deep down, what remained was a dark hole. An absence that ached even in the silence of the house. The messages stopped. The calls became bureaucratic. The wedding became a statement. And she left with a clear look in her eyes, as if relieved. I thought I would implode inside, but I didn't. I just kept breathing, because that's what you do when you survive betrayal, you keep breathing, even when the air hurts. She went to live what she thought was love. An office love, of exchanged glances between spreadsheets, of adrenaline hidden in the hallways. A love that, to her, seemed more vibrant than ours. But what she didn't know, and perhaps took a while to understand, is that the brilliance of something new doesn't mean depth. And love isn't just excitement, it's presence, respect, rootedness. What came next, I learned from others. She slowly discovered that he didn't want what she wanted. That he was skilled with words, with looks, with touch, but shallow in intention. That, to him, she was just another distraction. A relief from the routine. And when she came to her senses, he was already with someone else, smiling the same smile, offering the same compliments. She tried to turn back time, but time is not flexible with those who waste it. Pride turned to regret. Euphoria turned to emptiness. And she began to look back. It was then that she sought me out. First with short sentences, with awkward silences, with excuses disguised as longing. Then, with a more sincere, rawer, more wounded request, she wanted to talk. And when we sat across from each other, months later, she was no longer the woman who had scorned me in that restaurant. She was someone else. There was pain in her voice. There was shame. And there was a weight she now carried alone. She said she regretted it. That she missed me. That she understood too late the value of what we had built. She apologized with her eyes before she could even speak. And I heard her. Every syllable. Every tear. Every silence between sentences. I heard her because true love isn't easy to forget, even when love no longer wants to stay. And in that moment, faced with her pain, I didn't feel anger. I felt compassion. Because I knew exactly where she was inside, in that dark place where regret resides. I'd been there. And I survived. I looked into her eyes and told her I was at peace. That I held no grudges. That I forgave her, yes. But forgiveness wasn't an invitation to return. It was freedom. Freedom for her to move on and find whatever life still held in store. And for me, freedom to finally breathe without pain. I had found someone. Someone who saw me. Who respected me. Who chose me every day, without hesitation. Someone who didn't see me as an alternative, but as a choice. And this new love wasn't born of escape, but of healing. She cried. And so did I. Because sometimes the most painful ending is the one that comes with understanding. There was no shouting, no drama. There was only the realization that love dies when you choose another path, and that some choices cannot be undone. We left that meeting with tears in our eyes, but with light hearts. She, because she said what she needed to. I, because I knew I would never return. We were now just two chapters that no longer belong together. Friends, perhaps. Or just memories that respect each other. But what nobody knows, what I still wonder about today, is when, exactly, her love for me ended. Was it the routine that swallowed us? The absences I didn't notice? Or was it simply an impulsive choice, without warning, like someone who opens a window and jumps out, thinking they can fly? The curious thing is that, even after everything, there's one scene that still haunts me. Something she said to me when she said goodbye that night. Something that, even though I've moved on, still echoes sometimes, like a half-open door from the past. She looked at me and said, if one day I had understood what you were to me, maybe it would have been different. But would it? Or is it that certain choices, once made, are impossible to erase, no matter how hard the heart tries? And the most curious thing of all, is that I discovered something, well after, which she never knew I knew. Something that might change the course of our history. Or maybe not. But that only made sense much later. After love no longer lived there. Welcome to the channel. Here, cheating is not romance, it's a breakup. All the stories you will hear are fictional, but the feelings they evoke are real. Our goal is clear: show, without romanticizing, how betrayal destroys, hurts and leaves deep scars. Get ready to experience an intense story, full of emotion, regret and consequences. Because some choices, there is no turning back. Settle in. Take a deep breath. The story will begin. They met on a cloudy spring Saturday at the wedding of mutual friends, in a hall tucked away from the city, where the music wasn't too loud and people still allowed themselves to talk calmly. He, discreet and observant, watched the event as if carrying silence more than words. She, light and spontaneous, walked between the tables with an easy smile that seemed to light up the entire room. Their first contact came by chance, in a bump next to the dessert table, followed by an almost rehearsed apology and a sincere laugh that broke any possibility of awkwardness. Her name was Laura, his, Daniel. And at that moment, they didn't know it yet, but they had begun the first line of a story that would completely change the course of both their lives. Daniel was a civil engineer, passionate about structure, calculations, and predictability. His manner carried the calm of someone who learned early on to listen more than talk, and his gaze held a mixture of weariness and hope that sometimes confused those trying to understand him from afar. Laura was a psychologist, dividing her time between her office and giving lectures on emotional bonds, but she didn't seem to apply everything she preached to her patients to herself. She had a rush to live and an enthusiasm for new experiences, which contrasted with Daniel's calm confidence. And perhaps for that very reason, they worked. She made him smile without realizing it, and he made her feel anchored in a world that always seemed to spin too fast. Over time, their meetings became routine, and Sundays began to smell of coffee and warm cheese bread, always prepared by him. They lived in different neighborhoods, but it never felt too far apart. Conversation flowed naturally, the silences were comfortable, and there was that rare sense of belonging between them that isn't built overnight. It was Laura who said, "I love you," first, in a shy tone, almost as if apologizing for loving too soon. Daniel took 2 days to respond, not out of doubt, but out of fear of not being able to express everything he felt in words. When he finally did, she cried. It was what she'd expected, and yet it was as if she'd heard something she never thought she deserved. The wedding came after 3 years together. It wasn't a grand event, but it was beautiful. Close family, close friends, good music, simple food. What everyone saw was a stable, balanced couple, who complemented each other like two sides of the same story. In the photos, Daniel smiled little, as usual, but he looked at Lara as if he were keeping a good secret. And she seemed brimming with certainty. They decided to live in a single-story house with a small garden, which she insisted on tending on weekends. The furniture was chosen calmly, with time, and with care. Nothing was rushed, nothing was overdone. Just the two of them, living the beginning of a life together, as they had dreamed. During the first years of their marriage, things were harmonious. There were no luxuries, but there was complicity. Daniel worked for a mid-sized construction company and spent many hours away, but whenever he could, he made a point of returning home with something that reminded him of Lara, sometimes a book, other times just a flower from the path. She, on the other hand, hosted simple dinners at home, prepared his favorite dishes, and eagerly awaited the moment he would open the door. In everyone's eyes, they were an exemplary couple. Lara often said she loved the way Daniel looked at her as if it were the first time. And he, even without grand gestures, made a point of showing how much he cared, in the details, in his listening, in his constancy. But like any true story, over time, routine set in. Once long conversations began to be interrupted by fatigue. Texts throughout the day became rarer, kisses more hurried. It wasn't heartbreak, it wasn't disinterest, it was just life getting in the way, as it often does. Daniel was promoted and began taking on new projects, with more responsibility and less time. Lara, meanwhile, joined an academic research team that required travel, meetings, and new connections. The house remained organized, the bills paid, but there was a growing gap between them, almost imperceptible. A gap neither of them named, but both felt. There were days when Lara would return home after a work event and find Daniel watching television with a lost gaze. She would sit next to him but didn't speak. He, in turn, noticed her fatigue but no longer asked how her day had been. Intimacy began to give way to cordial coexistence. Kindness became habit. Touch, protocol. And yet, there was affection. They didn't fight, they didn't argue. They avoided conflict with frightening skill, as if they preferred silence to truth. Some Sundays were still good. Sometimes they relived old conversations, cooked together, laughed at inside jokes. But there was no longer the same sparkle in their eyes. Gestures of affection became an obligation. And although Lara still organized dinners and tried to keep the flame of their connection alive, something inside her seemed to have cooled. Daniel understood, but didn't know how to reclaim what they were losing. It was as if they were together, but alone. Trapped in an invisible bubble where the memory of what they once were sustained what they pretended to still be. Between one commitment and another, Lara began to stand out more in her field. She earned invitations to speak at companies, attended conferences, and began meeting new people. She grew professionally, while Daniel, though proud, found himself increasingly distant from the world she was beginning to inhabit. Communication between them became limited to the basics. They led parallel lives that intersected only over breakfast, in short messages, and on weekends they no longer spent together as they once did. Despite this, there was still a part of Daniel that believed it was just a phase. That with time, calm, and some dedication, they would find their way back. Lara was still the love of his life. And even though her gestures were colder, and her eyes were more distant, he preferred to think it was fatigue, work, the wear and tear of routine. He preferred hope to distrust. And perhaps it was this blind love, this silent surrender, that prevented him from seeing that something inside her was no longer his. Even during moments of greatest distance, Daniel made a point of being present at important events. One of the most memorable was an annual dinner hosted by a friendly couple, where they always celebrated the friendship between close couples. It was a tradition. And that year, he prepared everything so that dinner would be a renewal, a fresh start. He bought flowers, wore her favorite shirt, planned compliments, attempts at reconnecting. He believed there was still time. That it was still possible to recover what seemed to be slipping through his fingers. But what Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't even imagine, is that sometimes time doesn't heal, it only confirms what's already lost. And that night, something would happen that would change everything. Not with shouts, nor with scandal, but with a simple sentence, spoken with the coldness of someone who no longer recognizes the gaze of someone they once loved. Daniel's love was strong, but perhaps it wasn't enough for both of them. And Lara. Lara carried something he didn't know. Something that would begin to reveal itself there, at that dinner, and would forever change the course of the story they both believed they had written together. And the most impressive thing, is that until that very moment, Daniel still believed that love could conquer anything. He just didn't know that sometimes, those who love are those who suffer the most from the truth. That night, as Lara prepared for the couple's dinner, the house was plunged into a strange, almost ritualistic silence. She chose her dress with studied calm, as if calculating each step before taking it. She dabbed perfume behind her ears, precisely arranged her hair, and practiced a smile in front of the mirror that no longer held any truth. Daniel watched her from afar, from the bedroom doorway, leaning against the doorframe, like someone watching a play whose ending he already senses but refuses to accept. He still believed that dinner could rekindle something. He hoped that the light-hearted atmosphere among friends, the shared laughter, the glances exchanged between couples in love, could remind Lara of who they had been. He was wrong. But faith in love has this destructive ability to keep a man trapped in what is already over, even when everything around him screams otherwise. The car continued in silence. Only the radio filled the space, and even then at a low volume, as if both were avoiding any stimulus that required engagement. They arrived at the restaurant minutes early, and the hosts welcomed them enthusiastically, as they did every year. Lara smiled, greeted everyone, and distributed kisses and hugs with her usual lightheartedness, but Daniel noticed something in her gaze, something he couldn't name, but which made him uneasy. Dinner continued as usual, wine, jokes between couples, memories of travels, stories of children, plans for the future. And, as much as he tried to fit in with the atmosphere, Daniel felt out of place, as if he were only there physically. Lara was beside him, but at the same time elsewhere. Her gaze didn't meet his. The words I spoke to him were few, formal, cold. And that hurt more than any shouting or absence. Between glasses, she laughed out loud at something one of her friends said. She lightly touched Daniel's arm, trying to draw him into the conversation, but he noticed the touch was almost mechanical. There was no warmth, no intimacy. It was as if she were playing a role for the others, yet forgetting that the most attentive audience was sitting right next to her. Dinner continued, and with every bite, every polite comment, every forced laugh, Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Not from the food, not from the wine, but from a growing anguish that rose from his chest and invaded his entire body. And then came dessert time. The couples exchanged glances, some caressed each other discreetly, there were quick kisses, promises of new meetings. One of the hosts pulled a romantic game. The couples were supposed to, one by one, say something they admired about their partner and end with a kiss. It was something light, symbolic, but somehow, it became a kind of invisible test for Daniel. When his turn came, he took a deep breath, looked at Lara, and said he admired her strength, her courage, the way she dedicated herself to others. That even with all the changes and challenges, she remained, to him, an inspiring woman. And then he leaned in to kiss her, hoping perhaps that simple gesture could break the cold barrier between them. But Lara turned her face away. She smiled at the corner of her mouth, fixed her hair, and said, quietly but clearly enough for everyone at the table to hear, "I'd rather kiss my boss." The sentence dropped like a stone into a still lake. The silence that fell was immediate. Eyes met, hands froze on their cutlery, and for a moment, no one knew how to react. Daniel stood there, still, his face still tilted, trying to understand if he'd heard correctly. There was no irony in her voice. No joke. There was only a disconcerting coldness, as if that sentence had been choked up for days, waiting for the right moment to be vomited out. She then adjusted the napkin on her lap, as if nothing had happened. And Daniel, after a long second of paralysis, simply sat up in his chair, looked into her eyes, which expressed no emotion, and stood up. He didn't say a word. He didn't scream. He didn't complain. He didn't cry. He simply walked to the exit, under the embarrassed and astonished gazes of his friends, with a dignity that only true, wounded love can carry. When he got home, he walked in, slowly took off his shoes, hung his coat in its usual place, sat on the sofa, and simply stared into space. He tried to understand. He tried to absorb. He was trying, somehow, to put back together the world that had been shattered with a single sentence. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself, but the contempt. The casualness with which she exposed him, the coldness with which she denied a simple gesture of affection. A public rejection, without warning, without shame. It was as if she no longer saw him as a man, as a partner, as someone who had once shared her life with her. That night, he didn't cry. Nor the next day. He simply fell silent. He sank into a kind of silence that made more noise inside than any emotional outburst. In the following days, Lara didn't return home. She sent short messages, explaining that she was staying at a friend's house for a few days. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't ask for conversation. For the first time since he'd met her, he didn't feel responsible for maintaining their bond. He let silence fill the space between them. He cleaned the house, put her belongings in a box, and changed sides of the bed. Little by little, what was us became me. But what gnawed at him inside was doubt. When? When did it begin? Had it been in the absences? In the coldness of the conversations? Or had everything already been decided while he still believed in a new beginning? The betrayal itself was a sharp pain, but the feeling of being abandoned slowly, of not having noticed the collapse, was what kept him awake at night. Some friends tried to get in touch. Others pretended nothing had happened. Comments began to circulate in small groups. Some said Lara was confused, others that she had lost her way. But no one dared speak openly to Daniel about the matter. For a time, he became the one everyone looked at with pity but avoided looking at. The third week after dinner, she appeared. She entered the house as if she still belonged there. Daniel was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. He didn't turn around. He just said, "Hi." She responded, went into the living room, and sat down. After a few minutes of silence, she said she needed to talk. But it wasn't about the past. It was about the present. She wanted to understand if there was a way back. If there was still love. If he could, one day, forgive her. Daniel listened in silence. Then he left the knife in the sink, dried his hands, and sat across from her. The look he gave her wasn't one of anger or pain. It was a clear, transparent look, as if he no longer expected anything. He said he didn't know if he still loved her. That he needed time. That perhaps the love that existed there had already died with that sentence spoken in front of everyone. Lara cried. She said she'd gotten confused, that things had gotten out of control, that she didn't want to hurt him. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he simply said he needed to be alone. She understood. She grabbed her bag and left. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Daniel had already discovered something that completely changed what she thought he knew. A detail. A hidden piece of history that she never imagined had reached him. Something he kept hidden not out of revenge, but because he wasn't yet ready to face the weight of using it as an answer. And that detail, that secret, would be revealed soon. In due time. When everything was clearer. Rawer. And more devastating. Early that morning, Lara wasn't sure why she'd woken with a weight on her chest that seemed stronger than it had in the previous days. The sky was clear, the sun flooded the room with a soft light, and yet, inside her, everything was cloudy. There was a restlessness in her fingers, an urgency in her gaze, as if something were about to happen. She'd spent the last few days trying to regroup, reconnect with herself, find a trace of the woman she'd been before everything fell apart. She'd seen Daniel twice after that fateful dinner, and on both occasions he'd remained cordial, respectful, but distant. There was no hatred, no resentment, just a disconcerting calm. And that was what disturbed her most, the absence of visible pain. It was as if he'd already overcome what, for her, still hurt with all its force. That afternoon, she decided to look for him. Not on impulse, but out of necessity. She needed to say what she hadn't yet said. Apologize, yes, but more than that, she needed to tell the whole truth. She felt she owed him more than an apology, she owed him sincerity. She took with her the box containing some things she had left at the old house, small objects that, alone, seemed harmless, but together carried the story of a marriage. She arrived unannounced, knocking on the door with a heavy heart. Daniel opened the door with his usual calm, his eyes neutral, his breathing controlled. When he saw her, he stepped back and let her in. He said nothing. He simply pointed to the sofa. Lara sat down and remained silent for a few seconds, staring at her knees. Daniel sat in the chair next to her, crossed his arms, and waited. She said she needed to be heard, that she knew he wasn't hers anymore, but that even so, she needed to tell him everything. Daniel nodded but remained silent. She began by talking about her first conversations with her boss, the exchanged glances, the veiled innuendos. She said that at first it was nothing, that she never imagined she would overstep boundaries, but that little by little, the attention she received at work began to fill the voids left by marriage. She spoke of her inner turmoil, the mistakes she had made, the shame she now carried like a burden. And then she took a deep breath, clasped her hands, and revealed something Daniel already knew, but that she believed she was telling him for the first time. He said that a few months before the dinner, he had become emotionally and physically involved with his boss. He said it wasn't out of revenge, nor a lack of love, but out of weakness. That he had been carried away by misplaced admiration, by a need he couldn't recognize, by a stupid need to feel desired. She confessed with tears in her eyes that when she said that phrase at dinner, it wasn't to humiliate him, but because she was so lost she no longer knew how to act. She wanted to hurt him so he could feel what she felt inside. But now, looking back, there was no justification. She said she had made a mistake, that she was ashamed, that she would give anything to take it back. And when she finished, she looked up, perhaps expecting a reaction from him, a scream, a tear, a door slamming. But what she received was silence. Daniel stared at the floor for a few seconds. Then he got up, walked to the kitchen, got a glass of water, and returned. He sat down again, rested his elbows on his knees, and, in a low, firm voice, asked, "Are you done?" She nodded. He then took a deep breath and, with the serenity of someone carrying a heart in tightly glued pieces, said yes, he already knew. That he had found out days after dinner, when a mutual friend called him to talk. He said he hadn't wanted to believe it at first, that he thought it was a rumor, but that the way Lara's eyes had avoided his for the past few months already told him everything he refused to hear. But there was something else, something he had kept hidden until that moment, waiting for her to be honest, waiting for her to tell him herself. He stood up again, went to the bookshelf, and picked up a photograph. He handed it to her. It was a photo taken a few months before the dinner, at a company event. Lara was in the background, laughing next to her boss. The detail she hadn't noticed at the time, and which now jumped out at her like a punch, was that her boss was holding hands with a woman. A blonde woman in a red dress, whom she knew well. When she looked closer, her stomach lurched. It was her best friend's sister. And then Daniel said, without changing his tone, that the woman was married to the brother of the friend who was organizing the dinner. That her affair with her boss had become a silent scandal among some people in her social circle. That everyone knew about it except her. And that her humiliation had begun long before the dinner, she just didn't know it. Lara felt her face burn, as if every vein in her body was on fire. Her hands trembled, and for a few seconds she couldn't say anything. Daniel, for his part, showed no signs of anger. He said that what hurt him most wasn't the betrayal, but her choice to destroy him in public when he still believed they could save each other. He said the betrayal was a blow, but the exposure had been murder. And that now, even if she apologized 1,000 times, what had existed between them was gone. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt with words, or even with tears. It was like porcelain, once broken, it could be glued back together, but it would never be whole again. Lara tried to defend herself. She said she didn't know, that she never realized she was being used. That her boss claimed to be separated, that he wanted a future with her. But Daniel just interrupted her with a weary look and said that was the point. She chose someone who never truly chose her. She traded certainty for illusion. Love for vanity. And now, she was alone. The woman in the photo had exposed everything, the scandal was quietly spreading through all the groups, and her boss was already with someone else. She tried to return to the past, but the past had closed the door. Daniel then said that, despite everything, he forgave her. Not because he still loved her, but because he no longer wanted to carry that burden. That he needed to move forward lightly, free. That he had met someone who made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace. That this new woman wasn't trying to fill him, but rather complete him. And that, out of respect for this new phase, he could no longer live in the past. That Lara was part of his story, yes, but a part that had ended. Lara cried. Cried like never before. Cried with the pain of someone who understands they lost everything with a thoughtless choice. She asked for another chance, not to get back together, but to maintain some kind of bond. She wanted, at least, to be remembered fondly. Daniel nodded. He said he wasn't her enemy. They could be friends, if she wanted. But that love, it was gone. That day, as she left the house, Lara felt an emptiness greater than any absence. And Daniel, as he closed the door, felt relief. Because sometimes, what seemed like love was just attachment. And true love, that's what begins with respect. And begins again with dignity. Lara didn't return home that night. She drove aimlessly for almost an hour, navigating streets that seemed darker than usual, unsure if the cold she felt came from the wind blowing through the crack in the window or from the loneliness that had finally overtaken her. She parked the car on a random avenue, rested her head on the steering wheel, and wept softly. There was no longer any way to lie to herself. There was no longer any way to escape the truth Daniel had shown her so calmly, perhaps too calmly. The woman in the photo, the humiliation that ran silently among those who knew, the betrayal she thought she controlled, it all now came crashing down, burying what little dignity she still thought she had. The penny had dropped with a dull thud. She wasn't just the woman who destroyed a marriage, she was also the one who had been deceived and discarded by someone who never even considered taking her seriously. The next day, she couldn't bring herself to get out of bed. The walls of her rented apartment felt smaller, more suffocating, as if they were judging her too. Her best friend's messages went unanswered, her event invitations ignored. For the first time, she experienced absolute silence, not from without, but from within. There were no excuses to be made, no stories to be told. The masks had fallen, all of them, including the ones she wore on herself. Her boss no longer returned her messages. He'd said, in a light, almost cynical tone, that it was better this way, that things had gotten out of control, that he didn't want complications. She listened to this with dry eyes and a broken heart, not out of love for him, but out of the painful realization that it was just a passing error in the routine of a man who never considered her as a future. She was disposable, like a sip of wine from a plastic cup. Daniel, on the other hand, resumed his routine with a silence still present, but now different. It was a silence of reorganization, no longer of pain. He returned from work early, kept the plants watered, washed the dishes while listening to music. One day after another, unhurried, without relapses. He no longer checked his phone for a message, and Lara's name no longer throbbed as it once did. He had met someone at a course he'd started attending on Saturdays. Her name was Sophia. They had simple but profound conversations. Nothing forced. No attempt to fill gaps, just the lightness of meeting someone new with a clean soul. He still didn't call it love, but there was something different about the way he smiled after their encounters, the subtle glow that returned to his eyes, and the way his thoughts were no longer pierced by painful memories. A week after her last meeting with Daniel, Lara summoned the courage to visit his mother. Dona Helena had welcomed her like a daughter during their marriage, always with affection, advice, and a sweetness that now hurt to remember. Lara arrived with sweaty hands, her heart pounding, and a pained expression on her face. He rang the doorbell, unsure of what to say, but when the gate opened, the woman's reaction was unexpectedly calm. There was no hug, no laughter, but no door closed either. Dona Helena simply looked, nodded, and waved him in. In the living room, the scent of chamomile tea filled the air. They sat down without ceremony, and after a brief silence, Lara broke down. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but she needed to be looked in the eye by someone who had once welcomed her. She needed to acknowledge the harm she had caused. Dona Helena listened to everything, her hands in her lap, her gaze steady. When Lara finished, the answer came simply, "I loved you like a daughter. And because of that, my heart is at peace. But Daniel, he's my son. And he gave you everything. You broke something that can't be fixed with regret. Forgiveness, yes. But like before? Never again." That hurt more than any accusation. Days passed, and Lara began to try to rebuild herself amidst the ruins. She sought therapy, left work, and isolated herself from her old circles. It wasn't an escape, it was an attempt at transformation. She knew she couldn't erase what she'd done, but she refused to be just the mistake. She began writing in an old notebook, stray words, outbursts, reflections. Sometimes, she wrote letters to Daniel that would never be sent. In one, she admitted she'd betrayed him before he even left her body. That she'd betrayed him when she'd stopped seeing his presence, when she'd wished for another life without saying it, when she'd pretended to be fine while she'd walked away. In another, she thanked him for being kind even after discovering everything. She said the love he offered was so complete that only someone deeply broken would be unable to accept it. The letters were her way of purging her guilt, of understanding that the pain she felt now was only part of the price. Meanwhile, Daniel and Sophia grew closer naturally. She didn't ask questions about the past, just listened when he decided to speak. One day, on a late afternoon walk, he told her everything. The dinner, the phrase, the silence afterward, the discovery, the photo. He told her without rancor, simply as if banishing a ghost that no longer haunts. Sophia didn't interrupt. In the end, she simply said, "You deserve someone who sees you even on cloudy days." And she held his hand firmly. Daniel didn't respond, but in that touch there was something new, a sense that a new beginning could be light, even after the storm. He no longer needed to search for meaning in the past, because now the present was beginning to take on a different color. A few months later, an unexpected reunion happened. It was the anniversary of one of the couples who frequented the dinners, and Lara, invited by her wife, decided to go, not out of pride, but because she wanted to show herself she could face what she'd caused. Daniel was there too. He arrived with Sophia. There was no awkwardness, just a polite wave, followed by a respectful distance. At a certain point in the evening, the two met on the balcony, alone. It was Lara who broke the silence. She said she was happy to see him well, that Sophia seemed like a good woman. Daniel thanked her. He said she seemed calmer too. And then they spent a few seconds just listening to the music coming from the living room, until Lara said, "You know, if I had ever understood what you meant to me, maybe it would have been different." Daniel smiled, but not ironically. It was a smile full of peace. He replied calmly, "Maybe. But love doesn't wait forever. It needs to be chosen every day." She nodded, her eyes welling up. And there, on that balcony, between two lives that no longer touched, forgiveness was sealed. They never saw each other again. Not because there was anger, but because some stories end even when there's affection. Lara moved on with her life, slowly rebuilding her identity away from the eyes of others. Daniel, now with Sophia, learned that it's possible to love again without carrying the scars like armor. What remained between them was respect. A painful but genuine respect. The memory of what they were, and the certainty of what they would never be again. And that's how some choices become sentences. Not out of revenge, but by the very nature of life. Because those who don't choose love when they have it may not get a second chance to receive it. And sometimes the greatest pain isn't being betrayed, it's realizing too late the value of what you lost. The reunion on that silent balcony brought no promises, no longing, no irrational impulse to reclaim something that no longer existed. It brought only what is rarely seen clearly when two people reach their end, lucidity. A sharp, mature lucidity, almost cruel in its clarity. Daniel's gaze, firm and gentle, was the mirror Lara needed to finally understand that what she once had, that whole, secure, patient love, she had lost. Not by chance, not by something beyond her reach, but by a deliberate choice, by a decision made while he could still have turned left. The silent farewell that took place there was final. There were no hugs, no tears exposed. But there was, in the air, an inevitable acceptance that weighed far more heavily than any shouting or resentment. And it was in this respectful silence that the new phase of their lives began to take shape more clearly, without the weight of illusions, without hope of return, with only what remained, the memory of what had already been and the awareness of what would never return. In the days following that encounter, Lara returned home with a different stillness. It was no longer the silence of mourning, but the silence of someone who had finally stopped fighting what was. She began to look inward with more responsibility. She stopped trying to justify her mistake. She stopped clinging to memories she had romanticized out of guilt. And for the first time, she began to ask herself not only what she had lost, but why she had never been able to appreciate what she had while she still had time. The question haunted her because she had no simple answer. There was no external villain, no comfortable excuse. The betrayal was not born of a single moment, but of a sequence of small, selfish decisions, vanities masquerading as freedom, insecurities disguised as strength. She had confused desire with love, movement with evolution, and now she was paying the price for having ignored everything that mattered in exchange for a fragile fantasy. Rebuilding herself wasn't simple. She wasn't seeking solace in new relationships, nor was she trying to fill her time with distractions. What she really wanted was to understand how one loses oneself even when surrounded by everything one once desired. Her therapy sessions became more intense, more honest. The days were no longer heavy, but still not light. And she knew they might not be for long. But for the first time, she wasn't trying to escape this pain on impulse. She wanted to go through it whole. She wanted to look her own reflection in the face, without looking away, without shaping the image. She wanted to be, once again, someone capable of loving truly, and, more than that, worthy of the love she had once received. Daniel, for his part, was moving steadily forward in his new relationship. The lightness Sophia brought wasn't the euphoria of intense beginnings, but the peace of serene encounters. There was no need to prove anything, to compete with the past, to avoid difficult topics. They talked about everything, including Lara when necessary. Sophia showed no jealousy, only empathy. She understood that true love, even after it's broken, leaves scars that need to be cared for patiently. She didn't rush him to forget, nor did she demand comparisons. And this made Daniel open up more trusting. He began to realize that, although traces of pain still lingered, he no longer felt Lara's absence as before. The memory was no longer accompanied by bitterness, but rather like a story left behind. His heart, once so drowned in sorrow, now found room to breathe again. One autumn afternoon, after leaving work, Daniel ran into one of the friends who had attended the New Year's Eve dinner. They sat in a discreet cafe, where the clink of cups mingled with the ambient music. The conversation wandered through various topics until, inevitably, it reached the one they both avoided naming. The friend commented that Lara had changed, that she seemed more introspective, more mature. Daniel listened in silence, with a slight nod. He felt neither pride nor resentment. He felt only understanding. It was like watching from afar a fire that has since been extinguished but has left its mark on the ground. And when his friend asked if he regretted having loved her, Daniel replied with calm sincerity, "No. Loving someone, even if it ends, is never a loss. Loss is loving without being seen. And that I don't do anymore." That same week, Lara received an unexpected invitation to give a talk on emotional bonds at an academic event. She hesitated. For a long time, she had avoided speaking about this topic, as if the right to address it had been taken away with her downfall. But something inside her told her that perhaps this was the way to transform guilt into purpose. She prepared her speech carefully, rereading old texts, reflecting on experiences, but above all, being honest about her own mistakes. When she took the stage, her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. She spoke about the complexity of affection, how love can be wounded by small distractions, and how easy it is to lose oneself when one constantly seeks approval in false mirrors. She didn't mention names or personal stories, but those listening felt that those words came from someone who knew, firsthand, what she was talking about. After the event, she was approached by a teary-eyed young woman who thanked her for the talk and said she was about to repeat a similar mistake. She said that hearing Lara speak made her rethink everything. And in that moment, for the first time since the end, she felt that perhaps something good could come from it all. Perhaps her story would serve to prevent further downfalls. Perhaps, by admitting her failures publicly, she could rewrite her trajectory not as a victim or a villain, but as someone who had the courage to change. Over time, Lara and Daniel began to cross paths occasionally at events, public places, birthdays. There was always respect. Sometimes a nod, other times a brief smile. The conversation never went beyond the surface, but that was enough. The bond no longer existed, but the peace did. And it was this peace that allowed them both to move on without carrying unnecessary burdens. Sophia, by Daniel's side, was now a constant presence. There were plans, travel plans, conversations about moving in together. He was still reserved with his words, as he always had been, but those who knew him closely saw how much he had relearned to smile. The sparkle in his eyes was no longer the same as before, it was different, less romantic perhaps, but more genuine. It was the look of someone who had gone through immense pain and emerged on the other side more self-aware. For Lara, the days took on a different rhythm. She was still alone, by choice. She felt she needed more time for herself before making room for someone else. She had loyal friends, a more balanced routine, and the feeling, albeit subtle, that she was finally relearning how to live with dignity. She carried guilt, yes, but it was no longer an unbearable burden. It was a constant reminder of what she no longer wanted to be. It was, in a way, her guiding light. There was, however, a dilemma that still haunted her thoughts. A moral dilemma, one that might never be fully resolved. She wondered if a mistake defines a person forever. If a betrayal is a full stop or just a comma in the construction of a human being. She wondered if the chance to be forgiven, even if Daniel had already given her, should also come from herself. Because there were days when, even with all the progress, he still looked in the mirror and saw the woman who once chose the wrong path. And on those days, she wondered if a broken heart had the right to love again. But even without answers, she kept going. She knew the journey was long, but that each step taken consciously took her away from the person she no longer wanted to be. And so, while one started over with someone new, and the other rebuilt herself from within, the story continued. Not with explosions or twists, but with the naturalness that real life demands. Because in the end, the hardest part isn't losing someone, it's losing yourself. And true forgiveness, the kind that frees, comes not only when someone else apologizes, but when we are able to look at ourselves honestly and decide to be better than we were. The wind that afternoon blew hard, scattering dry leaves across the stone floor of the park where Lara walked slowly, hands in her coat pockets and eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Autumn had this gift of putting everything into perspective. It was as if nature itself decided to strip itself bare, revealing its vulnerability, accepting that to be reborn, one must first let die. She came there often, not just to reflect, but because she had learned to find solace in cycles. In the ebb and flow of the seasons, in what fades to make room for what emerges next. She was far from any attempt to erase the past, but little by little she was learning to integrate it into her narrative without it completely defining her. She still felt the pain of loss, of course, but now it was a less acute, more mature pain, accompanied by learning. And perhaps that was what surprised her most, the ability to grow within her own mistakes, even if the price had been extremely high. That same afternoon, on the other side of the city, Daniel was finishing a meeting with clients at a cafe further from the center. Sophia accompanied him, as she had done frequently in recent months, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest in being a part of his life in a broader sense. They weren't living a fairy tale. They had their disagreements, their routines, their fatigue. But what they were building together was solid and real. Daniel was no longer afraid to open up, though he still chose his words carefully. He had learned that not all pain needs to be shared immediately, that some wounds require silence to heal. Watching Sophia laugh at something the waiter had said, he found himself smiling too, not because of the comment, but because of the sense of peace she brought. It was a kind of peace he hadn't known when he was with Lara. And understanding this wasn't a criticism of the past, but a clear sign that he had, in fact, freed himself from it. A few days later, fate, which loves to create its own ironies, placed them in the same environment again. A professional seminar brought together speakers from different fields, and both Lara and Sophia had been invited. When they saw each other in the entrance hall, there was a brief moment of hesitation between them. It wasn't discomfort, nor was it embarrassment. It was a mutual recognition, a silent reading of the path each had traveled to be there, standing whole, albeit with scars. Lara extended her hand, Sophia shook it firmly, and said simply, "I know who you were, but I can also see who you are becoming." It was the first time someone outside her supportive circle had acknowledged her transformation without resorting to the past as a label. And it deeply affected Lara, who spent the rest of the event with a weight lifted off her shoulders. The following week, Sophia broached the subject with Daniel over dinner at home. She told him about her encounter with Lara and what she'd said. Daniel listened attentively, as he always did, and after a few seconds, he responded that it was a noble gesture. But also a courageous one. It wasn't easy to look into the face of someone who, directly or indirectly, was part of such an old and complex pain. Sophia shrugged, saying that maturity had taught her that love only blossoms when one stops cultivating the shadow. They didn't return to the subject, but there was a calm complicity between them, as if they knew there was nothing left to fear. Lara, in turn, decided it was time to see someone she hadn't spoken to since the breakup, her best friend. The same person who, out of loyalty to Daniel and disappointment with her attitude, had cut ties indefinitely. It was a difficult meeting. The cafe they had chosen was small and cozy, but the atmosphere between them was charged with memories. Lara began by apologizing. She didn't try to justify herself. She said she knew she had broken a trust that went beyond her marriage. That the friendship she had destroyed hurt as much as the love she had lost. Her friend listened to her, keeping her eyes steady, but without aggression. And when Lara said she understood if forgiveness wasn't forthcoming, her response was direct, "You were the person I defended the most. And also the one who disappointed me the most. But that won't stop me from recognizing what you did with your own pain. You've grown. And that, even without approval, deserves respect." The phrase echoed in Lara's head for days. There was no complete reconciliation yet, but there was a gap. And sometimes, it is in the gap that healing begins. A few months passed, and at the beginning of a new year, Daniel and Sophia hosted an intimate dinner at home, just for close friends. The house was different now. The wall colors, the furniture, even the aroma. Everything carried her presence. Not as a replacement for what had existed, but as a reinvention. As the guests began to arrive, Sophia pulled him by the hand and whispered that this was the moment to give thanks, not for what they had lost, but for what they had been able to build after it. Daniel, his gaze fixed on the set table, murmured that he had never imagined he would feel so much gratitude after so much pain. And when his friends raised their glasses, toasting the new cycle, he felt, sincerely, that he was exactly where he should be. Meanwhile, Laura concluded her participation in a therapy group with an emotional speech. She spoke about the importance of facing who you are, not just what you appear to be. She said that not every fall destroys. Some, in fact, reveal. And that, although she had experienced harsh consequences, she was alive. She was more aware. She was, finally, learning to be someone she would like to meet. At the end of the meeting, a young woman approached her and said, "You have no idea how much you helped me." That was it. If there was a purpose in pain, it was this, to transform your story into a bridge. Not to cross back to the past, but to help others avoid falling into the same hole. One sunny weekend, while walking through a craft fair, Laura spotted Daniel in the distance. He was with Sophia, laughing at something a craftsman was saying. They didn't see her. She watched them for a few moments, with a mixture of nostalgia and peace. For the first time, she didn't feel the urge to run away or the desire to be seen. She just smiled. A small but genuine smile. She kept walking, passing colorful shacks, hearing children running, smelling food in the air. And in this ordinary setting, she understood that life wasn't made of cinematic twists and turns, but of small scenes that, together, created the backdrop for our reconstruction. As time passed, the characters in this story gradually moved away from the label that once defined them. Daniel was no longer just the betrayed man. Laura was no longer just the woman who betrayed. Sophia was no longer just the new partner. Everyone had become something greater. And perhaps therein lies the most human moral dilemma of all: are we always the worst mistake we make, or do we have the right to be remembered for what we become after it? This question lingered in Lara's thoughts for many days. Until, one night, sitting in bed, she wrote a final letter to Daniel, one she would never deliver. In it, she said she now understood that forgiveness isn't about forgetting, nor about returning. It's about freeing. Freeing the other, but most importantly, freeing herself. She said she had truly loved him. But that only now did she know what love meant. And that she hoped, one day, not only to be remembered for the ending, but also for the journey she took afterward. That if her love failed in the past, it was because she hadn't yet learned to be whole. And that now, finally, she was. She tucked the letter away in the back of a drawer. She lay down, turned off the light, and slept soundly for the first time in a long time. Because the forgiveness that truly transforms us begins when we make peace with who we were, without giving up on who we can still be. The following spring, the city seemed quieter, as if time had deliberately slowed down so everyone could find their own rhythm. Laura now lived in a small apartment with large windows and simple furniture. She had plants scattered in strategic corners, books stacked on the table, and a routine that mixed work, writing, and moments of contemplation. She had learned to live with the void, but not as someone who suffers absence, but as someone who uses space as an opportunity for reconstruction. She no longer sought approval in the eyes of others, nor did she seek shortcuts to forgiveness. She knew that, in certain cases, pain is not punishment, but a necessary process for the formation of conscience. And although she still carried the memory of what she had lost, it no longer prevented her from living. On the contrary, it served as a silent reminder of who she no longer wanted to be. And it was one late afternoon, while drinking coffee alone on a bench in the square, that she realized she no longer felt guilt. Not because she forgot what she had done, but because she had learned to transform her mistake into purpose. She no longer cried for the love she had lost, but was grateful for having loved, even if she had failed. Because even the love that failed left seeds in her that now blossomed with a different form, a different color, a different maturity. Across the city, Daniel closed the door to his new home, keys in hand and a serene look in his eyes. It was a single-story house with a discreet garden, where he and Sophia had decided to begin a new life. The move was gentle, unhurried, and devoid of idealizations. Neither of them carried ghosts, just carefully organized memories. Daniel had undergone silent transformations. He no longer sought certainty in details, nor tried to anticipate failures. He had learned that love isn't about guaranteeing the other will never make mistakes, but about building a space of truth where failures can be faced without destroying dignity. With Sophia, there was trust, but also freedom. She never demanded promises or oaths. Just presence. And that was what Daniel offered her. They were about to travel together for the first time. A lovingly planned itinerary, to a place far from their old ways, where no corner echoed with past memories. The night before the trip, as he closed his suitcase, he stopped in front of the mirror, studied his reflection for a few seconds, and smiled quietly. He was a man who loved, was hurt, started over, and now knew that true love is not the one that promises eternity, but the one that, even after the pain, can blossom with dignity. Sophia, for her part, remained steadfast in her resolve to live lightly, without carrying what didn't belong to her. Ever since she met Daniel, she knew he came from a dense history, marked by profound pain. But she never tried to replace him. Her choice was to walk beside him, not in front, not behind. There was something about him that enchanted her, a quiet strength, a gentle way of loving that didn't pressure, but offered. Sophia observed him in small gestures, the care he took in folding the clothes, the way he listened without interrupting, the way he held her hand when the subject was difficult. She needed no further proof. She felt that, finally, she was with someone who chose love every day. And for her, that was enough. That very night, lying beside him, she whispered that, for the first time in her life, she felt safe. And Daniel simply rested his forehead against hers and said, simply, that he did too. There were no promises there, just presence. And that was what made it all worth it. One night, late in the fall, Laura was invited to participate in a documentary about human relationships, personal reconstruction, and the journey after loss. The invitation came from one of the people who had attended her talk months earlier. She hesitated, but accepted. Not to expose herself, but to make sense of what she had experienced. In the interview, he spoke firmly about how a wrong choice can destroy not only a relationship, but entire parts of one's own identity. He said that betrayal, contrary to what many think, is not just about desire or adventure, it is about absence, about not knowing where you are, about running away from yourself. And that true repentance is not when you want to return, but when you understand what was destroyed and work to never repeat it. His words, sincere and painful, touched many people. And at the end of the recording, as she walked alone back home, she felt that perhaps, after so long, she had finally found peace. Not because she was absolved, but because she had learned to be responsible for the scars she left on others and the ones she carries within herself. A few months later, Daniel and Sophia received special news: they were expecting a child. It wasn't planned, but it was greeted with a mixture of amazement and serene joy. Daniel was silent for a few minutes when he heard it. Then he looked at her with teary eyes and said he didn't know if he was ready, but he knew he didn't want to go through any of that with anyone else. They cried together, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. And that same week, they began rearranging the rooms in their house, thinking about names, planning for the future. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was an honest one, built on the rubble that had been cleaned with truth. And when the baby was born, months later, Daniel held the child in his arms and thought, with a full heart, everything he had lost had prepared him for this. For that moment. For that new love, which asked for no guarantees, only surrender. In one of the final scenes of this story, Laura received an unexpected message. It was from Daniel. Short, respectful. It simply said he had seen the documentary and was happy she was using her pain to transform lives. That he admired her for it. There was no subtext. Just truth. She responded with a "thank you" and a period. Literal and emotional. That exchange was the subtle and definitive closing of a cycle. A cycle that began with love, crumbled with betrayal, but ended with respect. And perhaps, for true stories, that is the best possible ending. Now, if this story touched you in any way, comment below with your thoughts. We want to hear your thoughts. Which character resonated with you the most? What would you do differently? And if you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, the stories may be fiction, but the feelings are real. This story reminds us of something important: betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship. It erodes trust, disfigures love, and shatters invisible parts that often never heal. The pain of disappointment goes far beyond the moment the truth is discovered. It spreads, impacting families, friends, and especially the betrayers themselves, who one day must face the echo of their choices. May this narrative serve as a warning, a mirror, a point of reflection. And an important reminder: this channel does not support, normalize, or romanticize any kind of betrayal. We're here to tell stories that expose the consequences and make us think. Because love is also about choosing, every day, with respect, presence, and truth.